So playing against calling stations can be one of the most frustrating things at the poker table. But if you just make a few key adjustments, it becomes a lot easier, and actually these become some of the most profitable players to play against. The first thing is in regards to your opening ranges, and it all comes down to position. If you expect to be out of position versus a known calling station, then you'll want to tighten up your opening ranges. You'll also maybe want to rearrange your range slightly to include more hands that flop well as more hands that have showdown value. You know, a lot of your ace highs, maybe some of your smaller pocket pairs, and then also the hands that flop well, you know, like your jack tens, your suited connectors, and those type of hands. So when you're in position versus a calling station, you actually want to widen your opening ranges. You want to play as many hands in position because these are basically fish a lot of the time. They're taking hands to the river that are marginal, so you can get a lot more thin value versus them when you do connect with a board or even just have showdown value. The next thing you want to do is in your opening raise sizes. So when you have the more marginal hands in your range, you want to keep the pot small. So instead of maybe doing your normal 2.5 or 3x raise, you might min raise when there's a calling station behind you. You decide when the pot gets bigger post flop. You don't let them decide for you, right? So you want to keep the pot small, play small ball, and then make post flop decisions on whether to build a pot or not. If you are raising 2.5 or 3x or bigger when you have calling stations involved, then you really are just burning money because a lot of the time you're just building a pot for somebody else. Of course, on the other hand, if you have the top of your range pre-flop, you know, like your big pocket pairs, your ace kings, ace queens, those type of hands, you want to actually increase the size of your bets. The hands that have a much better chance of being still good on the flop, you want to build as big a pot as possible so you can get as much value versus these calling stations who are taking these marginal hands to later streets as possible. So instead of raising your normal 2.5x, for example, you might raise 3, 3.5, 4, even 5x with the top of your range. Don't worry about trying to balance your bet sizings because these players are not paying attention to whether you're balanced or not anyway. They're unbalanced, so you can be a little bit unbalanced. And on the subject of betting larger, when you do have a clear value bet after the flop, you want to tend to size up those bets. So if your normal value betting amount is something like 2/3 pot after the flop with maybe your top pair type hands or your over pairs, go ahead and size those up. Bet 3/4 pot, bet pot. These players aren't paying so much attention to how much you're betting versus just, can I hit my gut shot on the turn, or can I hit my backdoor 2-pair draw, or whatever they're thinking. They're more paying attention to what their own hand is rather than how much money they're putting into the pot. So bet bigger when you have the top of your range, once again post flop, but also bet smaller when you have more marginal hands, hands that you maybe still could get value, or hands that you have equity in that maybe you can realize equity with. Downsize those bets. If you have third pair, bet a third pot, bet 25% pot. Keep the pot small while you can still get value from a lot of the marginal hands in their range that they're continuing with. And while we're on the subject of value betting, widen your value betting range when you're playing against a calling station. So if normally your value betting range is like second pair, top pair, over pairs, and better, maybe now your value betting range is any piece of the board versus a calling station, because they can certainly continue with a wide swath of hands that aren't exactly made hands. Calling stations are eternal optimists. Some of them pretty much always want to see a turn, hoping they can hit that miracle card by the river. So that means that we can, as long as we size our bets down appropriately, can get value from hands that you would never expect to be able to get value from versus a standard player in a normal situation. So before I talk about the next key, I just wanted to briefly mention that my Poker Academy does give you a post-flop process for how to adjust to not just calling stations, but every major player type that you will ever encounter at the table. So be sure to go to automaticpoker.com and check it out and see if it's something you'd be interested in investing in. So I wasn't going to mention this key, because this is pretty much something everybody knows nowadays, and that is not to bluff versus calling stations. But I will put another spin on that. You can bluff versus calling stations. Just make sure you have some equity in your hand before you do so. If you have that backdoor flush draw, you definitely want to build that pot just in case you can get there, right? Because there's a huge value in actually building a pot and hitting some kind of hand like that. If you have overcards to the board, go ahead and bet those. Of course, bet small, control the size of the pot, because there's so much value in getting paid off by these hands on turns and rivers. You want to start building some type of pot as long as it's a reasonable amount of equity. Don't do this with like just one overcard or just a completely hopeless hand that has no chance of improving. Stick to the hands that have reasonable equity, even if it's backdoor equity. And when your hand actually does improve, you want to have a reasonable size pot so you can leverage a bigger bet size on later streets and get maximum value versus players that are actually going to pay you off. And that leads me to my last key, which is playing against calling stations on the river. If you happen to have a very strong hand on the river, you want to bet larger, but you also want to widen your value betting range on the river. Go for thin value more often versus calling stations than you would maybe in other situations. If you bet twice with second pair and get to the river, and normally you would check it back, go ahead and bet 35, 40% pot or whatever. Go for that thin value, because they're going to pay you off often enough, if they're true calling stations, to make this a profitable bet. They'll see, man, this guy's betting small and I have third pair. I'm calling. Or I have my ace high, the board paired on the river. I think I'm good here. I'm going to call. I'm going to look you up. They love to see showdowns. Sometimes they'll show up with a better top pair or something like that, but the times they pay you off with just absolute junk is going to make up for those times that they happen to show up with the top of their range. So if you make these few adjustments, playing against calling stations is no longer going to be something you dread, but something you actually look forward to, because the next best thing to fish is players that take marginal hands to later streets and pay off the top and middle of your range more often than everybody else. But you have to make those adjustments, or else they can just be a royal pain in the you-know-what. So thanks for watching. Good luck at the tables.